All right, guys, Tyler down here at Emerald City Guitars, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the Gibson Les Paul. It's about the best-selling electric guitar ever made. It's legendary. There's been books written about it, and there's been lawsuits over it. It's a guitar that really needs no introduction. So who designed it? Well, Les Paul designed it, right? You know, he's a legendary tinkerer. He had the log guitar back in 1941. He was really important with the development of solid bodies. I mean, hell, his name's right there on the headstock. Of course he designed it. Well, things actually might not be that simple, and there is some really compelling evidence that suggests that maybe he didn't have much to do at all with the design. So what's Les Paul's side of the story in the matter? Well, he's been interviewed a lot about it, and according to Les, he brought his log guitar, which is of course just a 4x4 piece of pine with Epiphone sides and the neck mounted in it. He brought that to Gibson in 1941 with the idea that they could put it into production. At that time, they took a look at it, and according to him, they kind of laughed him out of the building. They didn't think that idea for a solid core of a guitar would sell well at all. And so they sent Les on his way, and that was that. However, in the early 50s, like 50 or 51, he says, they approached him again after seeing Leo Fender have a little bit of success with his broadcaster at that time. They wanted to get into the solid body game, so they called Les back up and said, hey, we want you to design a guitar. So at that point, they came to terms. They wanted Les to design a signature guitar, and he got on it. Now, Les claims he designed every inch of the 1952 Les Paul as we know it, except for the carved top. He said that was somebody at Gibson's idea. But in his mind, his design went directly from the log, which is a 4x4 piece of pine again, with Epiphone sides stapled to it, a neck, directly to the 1952 Les Paul that we know today. That was his sort of progression of design. It might be worth mentioning too, in this same interview, he claims that both Paul Bigsby and Leo Fender came over to his backyard in the 40s and stole the idea for the Bigsby vibrato, as well as the Fender broadcaster, directly from him. He takes very direct and single-handed responsibility for both of those companies' success, so just bear that in mind. So that's what Les remembers, but who else was involved with it? Well, Gibson was, of course. So what's their side of the story? Well, Ted McCarty, who ran Gibson from 1948 to 1966, has a very, very different recollection of how things went down. According to Ted, the solid body guitar that Gibson made that would later become the Les Paul model was completed and in its final form even before Les was being considered as an endorser. So in those days, Les was known for playing Epiphone guitars, and there's kind of this understanding in the industry that he was pretty loyal to them. So Gibson pursuing Les for an endorsement deal in that time was kind of viewed as a waste of time. So similar to Les's recollection, Ted recalls that in the early 1950s, right around 1950, Gibson was feeling a lot of pressure as they're kind of watching Fender have a lot of success in the West with these solid body electric guitars, something that they hadn't really touched as of yet. So in 1950, Ted got kind of a committee together with the idea of designing their own solid body electric guitar. Fender was the only game in town at the time, and they felt like Fender was getting a lot of money that they could get a cut of. So in 1950, Ted McCarty puts this team together, a team of engineers and designers and factory workers, to kind of think tank design their solid body electric guitar. Some of the core members were John Weiss, who was the factory manager at the time at Gibson, Larry Allers, who's the head of the wood department, Rem Wall, who was a guitar player and he was in final assembly, Julius Belson, who was the personnel manager of Gibson at the time, as well as Wilbur Marker, who was kind of the manager of custom instruments. So those were the core members. They did consult with other engineers and other Gibson employees, but those were kind of the core. So after about a year of this development with this little think tank team, apparently the first version of the Gibson solid body guitar is ready to go. There's a prototype ready to go. Now, who's going to endorse it? Well, Gibson thought they should get the best jazz guitarist in New York. So who was that? At the time, Ted thought it was Tony Mottola. So they brought it over to him, and Tony thought it was nice, but he was a very traditional jazz player. He was a hollow body player. He thought this new guitar, it played fine, it sounded okay, but it just wasn't really him. And so he kind of sent Gibson on their way, and that was that. So after being rejected by Tony Mottola, Ted thought, hey, we know Les Paul, let's reach out to him and see if he's interested. So they reached out to Les Paul, who at the time was out in the mountains of Pennsylvania, kind of up, locked away in a cabin, recording an album with his then wife, Mary Ford. So Ted McCarty got this guitar, flew up there, rented a car, drove up to the cabin, and brought Les Paul this new solid body guitar. So Les Paul and Mary Ford, they play the guitar for hours, and they both love it so much and Les is totally on board. Now, him and Ted write up a contract, they work out kind of an endorsement deal, they both sign it, and that is that. The only change, according to Ted McCarty, that Les Paul had on the original Les Paul model was the wrap under tailpiece. I guess they'd originally had a standard trapeze with sort of a regular bridge, but Les wanted that wrap under solid bar trapeze tailpiece. So we all know how great that was. So that's Gibson's side of the story, and there have been several interviews with old-time Gibson employees who kind of more corroborate this idea of, designed by committee rather than just Les bringing this finished guitar into Gibson. But it does seem kind of like a he said situation. So who do you believe? Do you take Les Paul's word, or do you take the word of the guys at Gibson? So why am I a little bit more prone to believe the Gibson guys instead of Les Paul? Well, that's because I believe the guys at Gibson had seen something very, very similar to the Les Paul model years prior. I don't think Les designed it, but I also don't think Gibson can take total credit, and that's because of a little-known inventor from Iowa named O.W. Appleton. So O.W. Appleton, as his friends called him App, he was many things. He was an inventor, he was a prolific musician, he was a music teacher, he also owned an instrument retail store for a while. He did a lot of things. But his most important, in my opinion, innovation came in 1941. So for years, App had been working on ways to increase sustain with his guitars. And apparently one day he was playing one of his little acoustics and noticed that when he put a little block of lead up against the bridge, he would see much more sustain in the instrument. And through this, he kind of developed the idea that if you could limit how much the top of a guitar moves, you would have much more sustain. So his reasoning was that if you could stop the top of a guitar from vibrating, the sustain would increase greatly. So, in order to explore that hypothesis, he had the idea of filling a guitar full of sand to stop the top from moving, or even salt at one point. But in the end, he decided to just start from scratch. And he went down to the lumber yard, he bought a slab of pine, and he carved himself a completely solid arch-top, single cutaway electric guitar, the first one ever made. Now, if you look at a picture of it, I'm quite sure you'll recognize it. So to make things even worse, App had a couple friends at Gibson. So he brought this new guitar that he had just built to his friends at Gibson and kind of pitched it to them as, something that they would want to put into production. At that time, though, kind of like Les said, Gibson wasn't really interested in solid body electric guitars. They just wouldn't sell at that time. So they thanked him for his idea and they sent him on his way. So for the next couple of years, App really did try to get this guitar into production. He pursued patents on it, which proved to be pretty difficult in small town Iowa. He couldn't really find a good patent lawyer. And then, a couple of years later, as World War II rolled around, manufacturing was definitely going a different way. A lot of guitar manufacturers were stepping towards, war effort manufacturing. So he kind of put a pin in the entire idea of having the solid body guitar produced. So this idea was kind of shelved until 1952, when apparently App received a letter from Gibson saying something to the effect of, "Oh man, we should have listened to you 10 years ago. You ended up being completely right." And they included a little brochure of their brand new Gibson Les Paul model. App was none too pleased to get this letter, obviously, and apparently in a fit of rage, he tore it up and threw it away. So there's no actual evidence of this letter, but the resemblance is absolutely uncanny, and I don't think there's really any way to deny a direct and heavy influence of App's early guitar on what would become the Les Paul model. So, who designed the Les Paul? Was it Les Paul? Well, no, I really don't think so. It's possible he designed a couple details of it, things like the wrap under tailpiece, and some people say he liked the gold and that was his idea, but altogether, no, he really didn't. And I think Tony Bacon, who is a legendary guitar historian, he's written so many books on early electric guitars as well as Les Paul, I think he said it best about Les. When talking about interviewing Les, he said, and I quote, "Often it was hard to set apart what really happened and what was occurring largely in his vivid imagination. Les was always engaging and entertaining, always eager to be at the heart of whatever subject you cared to offer him." End quote. Bear in mind, Tony Bacon and Les Paul were very, very close friends. So that just goes to show, even people who loved him and were very close to him realized that he had sort of an imagination when it comes to these things. So did Gibson design the Les Paul? No, I also don't think they really did. They had a couple innovations. They did the maple cap on the mahogany body. That was kind of new. They put two pickups in it. but altogether, I don't think they can really take credit for much of it. So if anyone does have a legitimate claim to being the designer of the Gibson Les Paul, it's got to be O.W. Appleton, even though he received virtually no credit and most people haven't even heard of him. As always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.